Welcome back everyone. We're going to be doing another comparison today between these two beloved iPads. And they're actually pretty close together when it comes down to the years they were released. The iPad Air came out in 2019, so just a little bit over a year ago, where the new iPad Pro, the 4th gens, just came out like a couple months ago. So I should have reviewed these when they first came out, but I forgot to do it, but it is what it is. Now the iPad Pro does come out in two different models, so the 11-inch and the 12.9-inch model. And I'll be completely honest, like if you have all the money in the world, picking up an iPad Pro is probably the better way to go. And I think that's, it says it in and of itself, it's a very good tablet. It looks extremely nice. You don't have to deal with the home button and anything like that. However, you still have all the gestures and everything on the iPad Air. And I think for the majority of people, the iPad Air 2019 is still extremely good enough. And I think it's more than good enough. I mean, it's like still a very, very good iPad. And here's the thing I will tell you. Basically, every single thing that the iPad Pro can do, the iPad Air can do for the most part. You know what I mean? It can do almost exactly the same things. Really, the main differences are probably a little bit in the speed and the performance, but also when it comes down to the camera on the back, you have that additional LiDAR sensor. So if you need a better camera setup, or if you're a developer that needs to use that LiDAR sensor, you have that capability on the iPad Pro where you don't necessarily have it on the iPad Air. So the biggest thing will probably come down to the price when it comes down to it. And for a better price per value dollar standpoint, you might be better off picking up an iPad Air, but the iPad Pro is the better iPad overall. So I'll go ahead and leave these two linked down below so you can get them from Amazon and help support the channel at the same time. Now looking on the front, the iPad Air 3 technically has a 10.5-inch IPS panel. It's a super good looking panel in my opinion. It's 1668 by 2224 and you have True Tone on it, and I think at the end of the day it's a very good looking iPad. Even though you still have a little bit of bezel on the top and bottom, it's really not that big of a deal. I'm sure a lot of people have gotten used to it by now. You have that home button, which again is a little bit archaic, but I don't really think too many people care about it, which is a really good sign. So I think overall the way this iPad looks, I think it still, looks really good. You still have a little bit of, gripping if you want to, put your thumbs on the bezels or something like that. Versus on the iPad, you kind of have to constantly hold them on the sides, which can kind of get annoying sometimes. But I think the iPad Air, the way it looks in the front, still looks pretty good for the most part. The iPad Pro, though, does have two different models it comes in. So it has that 11-inch model as well as that 12.9-inch model. Now for my case, I did get that 12.9-inch model just because, it was the only one available. These things are getting sold out like crazy. And you have that IPS panel, like I stated, it's 2048 by 2732, quite a bit of numbers there. And I definitely do think the panel itself, I don't know if one looks way better than the other one, they look kind of the same. However, the iPad Pro's panel does look overall better just because of the capability that it has. With the lack of bezel around the display and all that, I mean, you have to give it the benefit of the doubt. It does look much better on the iPad Pro, in my opinion, than on the iPad Air. If you're holding an iPad every single day, it kind of looks futuristic to hold something like an iPad Pro versus an iPad Air. So that's kind of one big thing. It's probably not a deal breaker to a lot of you, but if you're constantly, using the gestures and wanting to go through all that stuff, of course the iPad Pro is probably the better way to go, but you still have a lot of that capability on the iPad Air 3 as well. So I don't think one really blows the other one out of the water when it comes down to that. Now on the bottom we have a lightning port on the iPad Air, but USB Type-C on the iPad Pro. Now some people might prefer the USB-C port, some people might prefer the lightning port. When it comes down to functionality, they both kind of offer the same things. You can still, input memory from between them and all that. What I will tell you though is that USB Type-C is a little bit more versatile. And another thing, you can actually do reverse charging, so you can actually charge devices from the iPad Pro, and I don't think you can do that with the iPad Air. So that's a really big thing with the iPad Pro. Now on the back, like I stated, a little bit different camera setups here. Single camera setup on the iPad Air, dual camera setup with the additional LiDAR sensor on the iPad Pro, and I'll get into those in a second. But really when it comes down to it, the iPad Pro definitely does feel more premium in my opinion. You have the flat sides on the iPad Pro, which is kind of reminiscent on the original iPhone 5s and those ones. With the iPad Air, feels like the regular iPad. If you've ever used the iPad Pro 10.5-inch, this is pretty much the same exact body, just reincarnated into this iPad. So I think when it comes down to it, for sure, I like both iPads. I think both of them are great, but I do probably say that the iPad Pro is probably the better one when it comes down to it in terms of the outside and the body. So in terms of the outside, that really pretty much covers it. Now hating on the software, this is where things are they're kind of hard to explain and kind of hard to understand. And I don't even think I have the correct answer for it yet. But so the iPad Air came out, a year ago in 2019, and they're both on the latest and greatest software. They're both on iPad OS, and I think these iPads run iPad OS extremely well. They're still one of the fastest iPads out there. The thing to keep in mind though is that when it comes down to the raw software and everything and all the features and everything, they have almost the exact same features. Like I stated, there's really not any insane features that are on the iPad Pro that the iPad Air 3 just does not have. Now with that being said, there are still some pretty big differences. So the iPad Pro will definitely be the faster one when it comes down to it. I'm not trying to say the iPad Air 3 is a slow one at all, but that is a pretty big difference. You're going to see some pretty big speed improvements if you go to the iPad Pro, but that's for the speed and performance section. When it comes down to the software, they're almost the same. Now Apple determines the longevity of the software support based on the chipsets inside, and they both at their core have the Apple A12 chips, the Apple A12 Bionic, but the iPad Pro does have the Apple A12Z Bionic chip, so kind of a little bit of a thing right there. I mean, it's kind of crazy. I'm not really too sure which one is going to outlast the other one. If anything, the iPad Pro will outlast the iPad Air 3, but that's still kind of hard to determine just because, the iPad Air 3 still kind of has an A12 chip in it, and so does the iPad Pro. So I don't really know which one's going to outlast the other one, but I'm sure it's not going to be by much. So when it comes down to the longevity of the support, I'll probably tell you that potentially the iPad Pro will outlast the iPad Air 3, but it's still kind of hard to tell. So I guess we're just going to have to wait and see what happens. And that pretty much covers it up in terms of the software standpoint. Now hitting on the performance, like I said, the iPad Air 3 has the Apple A12 Bionic chip, X-Core CPU, and 2 different models with 3 gigs of RAM on each model, where the iPad Pro has the Apple A12Z Bionic chip, octa-core CPU, and 4 different models, and all those models have 6 gigs of RAM. Now what I can tell you about the performance is that in my opinion, I think the performance is really, really good on both tablets. Now of course the iPad Pro is going to be the better performing iPad. That just completely makes sense. But with the iPad Air 3, you're getting, a really good performing iPad, but just in like a lower priced standpoint. I think that's the best way I can put it. Now with the iPad Air 3, you're getting 3 gigs of RAM, which is still good enough for, a lot of tasks out there. And I think the iPad Air 3 is the perfect iPad for students. It's low cost, it's way cheaper than a MacBook, and you can still do a lot of things with an iPad. Even with the iPad Air 3, you can go and split screen multitask apps, you can go and, have your notes on one side, you can do gaming on it, and everything for the most part runs extremely smooth on the iPad Air 3. But the iPad Pro does have the additional RAM, which is really cool. So if you're somebody who plans on, multitasking a lot of different apps, if you're a student or if you're a content creator or whatever, and you're going through a bunch of apps at a time, that's going to be a pretty big advantage that you have on the iPad Pro that you don't necessarily have on the iPad Air 3. Now another big thing to keep in mind is that the iPad Pro does support Apple Pencil 2, but the iPad Air 3 only supports Apple Pencil 1. So that's another quick thing. Again, probably not a deal breaker, but it is something to consider at the end of the day. So when it comes down to it, I think performance obviously is better on the iPad Pro, but the iPad Air 3 still is a pretty good performing iPad at the end of the day too. So that pretty much covers it up in terms of the performance standpoint. Now hitting on the cameras, this is a pretty big thing, but also not really, it just depends. The iPad Air 3 has an 8 megapixel camera, just a single camera setup, where the iPad Pro has a dual camera setup with a LiDAR sensor. So it has a 12 megapixel wide angle lens, a 10 megapixel ultra wide sensor, and then that depth sensor, so that LiDAR sensor. And you can do 4K 60 on the iPad Pro's camera, which is really cool. Now, I don't know how many people out there are going to be using an iPad Pro camera or even a camera on their iPad all the time, but if you're somebody who, uses an iPad camera, this is really cool. Now, like I stated, the LiDAR sensor is extremely important for developers if you want to go and, use some AR capability and all that stuff. It's really cool to have an iPad. This is the only Apple product right now, I think, that has a LiDAR sensor. So you can get in early and develop apps and things like that for, certain LiDAR sensor features or whatever, I don't know. So in terms of the camera, for sure, the iPad Pro is going to be the better one. 7 megapixel sensors on both on the front. You can do 60 frames on the iPad Pro on the front camera, were only 30 on the iPad Air 3. Probably not a big deal, but it is what it is. So in terms of the camera, the iPad Pro definitely wins here. Now ending it off with the battery life, the iPad Pro has a 9,720 mAh battery for the 12-inch model, and then a little bit smaller for the 11-inch model, where the iPad Air 3 has a 8,134 mAh battery. Now in my opinion, I think probably the iPad Air 3 has a better battery life by a little bit. I feel like the battery life on that iPad was really, really good, but the iPad Pro's battery is still really great too, and you have the capability of reverse charging, which is really cool too. So I don't really think one blows the other one out of the water, but I think the iPad Air 3 might just have the better battery life when it comes down to the overall longevity. But again, the iPad Pro does have that reverse charging, which is really cool too. So between both, which one should you pick up in 2020? What I think is, I think both tablets are extremely good, and I think they're really, really important, and I don't think one blows the other one out of the water, but I do think that the iPad Air is the better value per dollar, but the iPad Pro is the better tablet, you know what I mean? But a good sweet spot would be to pick up the iPad Pro 3rd generation, which was almost the same exact tablet as the 4th gen iPad Pro. It's just, a little bit faster. So I think for sure the iPad Pro is definitely the better way to go, but getting a used iPad Pro 3rd gen would probably be a better way to go too. And I'll leave one of those linked down below too if I find one on Amazon. So that's really pretty much it. If you guys have any other questions or anything, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count, so it means so much if you guys can hit that. Also check out the other links down in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my second channel. All those links are linked down below. I'd really appreciate it if you guys would check it out. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.